The neoclassical counter-revolution was a consequence of the conservative movement seen in the US and the UK in the 1980s, and produced a response, a counter-revolution to international dependency theory. The neoclassical approach favored supply-side economics, trickle-down economics, privatization, openness to international trade, openness to international investment, low taxes on businesses, and deregulation. Many ideas that in the US have become associated with Ronald Reagan and which traditionally has been incorporated into the policy platforms of the Republican Party. However, over time, the general approach became splintered and resulted in three different approaches, each more or less suspicious or more or less against the government and what the government can achieve. The three flavors of these neoclassical ideas are the free market approach, the public choice approach, and the market-friendly approach. The free market approach is the benchmark. This school of thought argued that only markets are efficient, so therefore all markets, product markets, input markets, should be left alone. The approach might recognize that not all markets are indeed perfect. That is, the approach might acknowledge the possibility of market failures, such as negative externalities like pollution or positive externalities like we see in healthcare. But the free market approach felt that all markets are almost perfect, and therefore, as a rule of thumb, competition will lead to more efficient outcomes and better resource allocations. That is, in terms of development, the free market approach would argue that developing country markets are efficient, and whatever imperfections might exist are of no consequence. Given this belief in markets, government intervention is by definition distortionary and will make everything worse. The next version is the public choice approach. This approach is even more suspicious and even more against the government. Public choice theory goes even farther than a free market approach, and this school of thought argue that a government cannot do anything right because the government is actually made up of people, politicians, bureaucrats, citizens, who will always act according to their own self-interest. Hence, as soon as you give a person power and authority, he or she will use that power for his or her own selfish ends in order to obtain rents, which will lead to corruption. Government officials and politicians will always try to enrich themselves by collecting bribes from people who seek their favor. The result from a reliance on a government is thus not only misallocated resources, but corruption and limits to freedom. The only solution is to not only promote free market, but also limit the reach and power of government. Okay, the third approach is called market-friendly approach, and it brings some balance and, in my opinion, sanity back to the table. The market-friendly approach realizes that there are in fact many market imperfections in developing countries, commodity markets, input markets, and markets for final goods, and therefore there is a need for a government to intervene. However, this is still very far away from the kind of intervention that international dependency theory promoted. The market-friendly approach argues that the government should intervene very carefully, and intervention has to follow strict guidelines, such as intervene reluctantly. Let markets work unless a government intervention is clearly needed. The state should avoid fiscal production and should avoid protecting domestic production of goods that can be imported more cheaply from abroad. 2. Apply checks and balances. Continually check state intervention against domestic and international market outcomes. 3. Intervene openly. Make state intervention simple, transparent, and subject to rules, rather than bureaucratic discretion. And 4. the government should also intervene in a non-selective way. That is, the government should not pick winners, but rather have all firms play by the same rules. There are many examples of when a government might be needed: to provide infrastructure, a public good; to protect the environment, negative externality; to provide healthcare and educational institutions, public good; to provide a regulatory framework. That is, a government might be needed whenever we observe market failures. It is fair to say that the market-friendly approach quickly became the norm among the economists of the World Bank in the 1990s, as opposed to their more extreme free market-leaning colleagues in the 1980s. The World Bank argued that a market-friendly approach was appropriate as long as the guidelines mentioned were followed, intervene reluctantly, transparently, and apply checks and balances. The government should thus focus on creating a suitable environment for private enterprise, inclusive economic and legal institutions, as well as help ensure high levels of human capital, education, and health. Just some few concluding thoughts about markets. Markets are very useful as a system to promote development and growth. Markets are able to direct the power of the invisible hand, that is the price system, so that resources are allocated in the best possible way. If the world is perfect, that is, there are no market failures, then markets will in fact result in the best allocation of our scarce resources. Unfortunately, we do not live in a perfect world. There are always many market failures all around us: environment, education, healthcare, infrastructure, etc. In addition, markets exist in a confusing mix of social institutions and norms, and these institutions and norms virtually assure that markets will not be perfect. They are also different from one country to the next country, which means that these social institutions and norms in poor nations are not well known or well understood by people working at the World Bank or the IMF. Hence, advice from international donor organizations might not be able to fix the markets, as was argued by the false paradigm model 2. In addition to the imperfect markets, markets are often not of much help to the very poor, because the very poor do not have the required money to motivate, to give an incentive to producers to meet their needs. Given the many potential problems with markets, while still recognizing markets' powerful potential to increase growth and development, it might seem that we need both markets and the government. This is probably something that most people would agree with. However, even if we agree on this, we quickly find ourselves in a position of trying to decide on where to draw the line. When is government needed? And how the government should intervene? And of course, we still have the problem of the existence of extractive institutions that international dependency theory brought to our attention. Once again, we must conclude that development is complicated. But we are now starting to have the tools with which to think about these complications.